My husband thought he was stripping me of everything, but he actually signed his own financial death warrant simply by not bothering to read the fine print on the documents he was so desperate to get his hands on. I sat there watching his smug face across the courtroom table, looking at a man who believed he was a winner, completely unaware that he had just bought himself a one-way ticket to social ruin. But for you to understand how we got here, I need to go back 4 weeks, to that cursed Tuesday when my perfect world, which I had spent 15 years building, shattered into pieces right between the salt and the butter dish on our kitchen table. My name is Megan, I'm 34, and until recently, I was the wife of David Miller, a man who believed success was his birthright, and that I was just a convenient tool to help him achieve it. We met when I was 19. I had just finished school and taken a job as a paralegal at a small firm, mostly just to escape my parents' helicopter parenting. David was 25, incredibly charming, ambitious, and obsessed with building his own real estate empire. He talked about the future as if it were already in his pocket, and I, being young and in love, promised to help him with the paperwork. We were married a year later, and a year after that our son Liam was born. While I was raising our child, I kept working part-time, putting every extra dollar into my own personal account because my grandmother always told me, a woman must have her own money, not secret money, just her own, something no one can take away. When David turned 30, his business finally took off, and he begged me to quit my job to help him full-time. He needed someone he could trust implicitly, a bookkeeper, an office manager, a decorator, someone to handle the contractors and smile at the clients. So I became his free everything. My official title was wife, but my unofficial role was the foundation that held his entire life together. For 11 years I poured myself into his dream while he collected awards, recognition, and pats on the back at industry events. At every party he thanked his team, his mentors, and his intuition, but somehow he never found the words to thank me. Then something shifted. David started making decisions without consulting me, staying out late and criticizing the way I dressed, what I cooked, and most ironically, my lack of ambition. I was running his entire back office for free, raising our son, and keeping his life in perfect order, but apparently that wasn't enough. Exactly 1 month ago, he dropped the bomb. He came home on a Tuesday evening while I was cooking his favorite dinner, because apparently I was a glutton for unappreciated effort. He sat me down at the kitchen table with a face like he was about to discuss a quarterly report rather than the end of our marriage. "I want a divorce," he said casually. Then he added a phrase that still rings in my ears. "I want the house, the cars, the business, everything. You can keep Liam." He said it as if he were ordering food at a restaurant. "I'll take the assets, please, and take the kid off the bill, thanks." 15 years of marriage ended with my son being treated like leftover pizza that he was generously allowing me to keep. I just stared at him, unable to speak. What I didn't know then was that David had been planning this for months. He already had a high-priced lawyer, Robert Harris, and a clear exit strategy he'd been building, while I was busy booking his dentist appointments and planning our family weekends. I was betrayed by the person I trusted most. The next day, his mother, Martha Miller, showed up. This woman, who had treated me like a servant for 15 years, arrived with her perfect hair and her practiced sympathy face. She patted my hand and told me I should have tried harder to make him happy. "Men have needs, dear," she sang, as if explaining something complex to a toddler. Martha's marriage advice was always a joke, considering her own husband spent 7 days a week on the golf course just to avoid being in the same room as her. That first week was a blur. David moved me into the guest room of our own house. Documents were being drafted, schedules were being set, and everything was moving so fast I felt like I was drowning. Everyone around us saw a woman whose world had collapsed, a victim thrown out like trash after 15 years of service. But there was one detail David didn't know, Martha didn't know, and no one else knew. 3 years ago, while digging through the company's financial records late at night, I found something that was supposed to stay hidden forever. And all that time, I had been quietly, patiently, and very methodically preparing for this exact moment. I knew this day would come, and I was ready to turn his triumph into the most crushing defeat he could ever imagine. That first week, I let them think I was broken and giving up without a fight, because an undervalued woman is the most dangerous force in the world, and David always knew how to undervalue people better than anyone else. That was the start of my 1-month countdown to revenge. By the start of the second week, the atmosphere in the house had shifted from heavy silence to an active psychological war zone. Living in the guest room of a house I had decorated, paid for, and maintained felt like being a prisoner in a museum of my own life. David didn't even pretend to be civil anymore. He was already acting like I was a ghost, someone who just hadn't realized they were dead yet. He would walk past me in the hallway while talking loudly on the phone about streamlining the transition and liquidating unnecessary liabilities. It didn't take a genius to realize that I was the primary liability he was looking to liquidate. He had become obsessed with his image as the self-made bachelor who was finally shedding the weight of a domestic life that held him back. The most painful part wasn't even his coldness. It was how he started treating our son Liam. Liam is 10 and he's observant. He saw the way his father stopped looking him in the eye. David started missing Liam's soccer practices and late-night reading sessions, claiming he was too busy securing our future. But we all knew which future he was talking about. One evening I found Liam sitting on the stairs, clutching his backpack, waiting for a dinner with his dad that David had canceled via a text message to me. David didn't even have the decency to tell his son himself. When David finally came home that night, smelling of expensive bourbon and high-end steak, I tried to talk to him in the kitchen. I told him he couldn't just ignore his son because he was bored of his wife. He didn't even look up from his phone. He just said, "He has you, doesn't he? That's what you wanted. Don't complain about the workload now that you've got the primary custody you were so worried about." That was the moment I realized David didn't just want a divorce. He wanted to erase the last 15 years entirely. He wanted the success, the money, and the house, but he wanted them without the burden of the family that helped him get there. A few days later, his mother, Martha, showed up again. She didn't even knock. She still had her key, which David refused to take back. She walked into the kitchen where I was trying to organize some of the company's older tax filings, the ones I had forgotten to hand over to David's new assistant, a 24-year-old named Chloe who didn't know the difference between a balance sheet and a grocery list. Martha sat down, adjusted her pearls, and sighed as if she were the one suffering. She told me that David was stressed, and that I was making things harder by being difficult about the settlement papers. "Megan dear," she said, her voice dripping with that fake upper-class concern, "you have to understand that David built that company with his own sweat and blood. It's only fair that he keeps the fruits of his labor. You were just supportive. And he's being very generous offering you that small alimony for 2 years. Most men in his position wouldn't be so kind to a wife who clearly stopped caring about her appearance years ago." I just sat there, staring at the tea I had made her, realizing that these people truly believed their own lies. They had rewritten history so thoroughly that in their minds, I was just a decorative piece of furniture that had grown dusty and needed to be replaced. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I just nodded and said I would think about it. Inside I was vibrating with a cold, precise rage. The consultant David hired, Chloe, started showing up at the house under the guise of transferring files. It was insulting. She would sit in my office, the one I had spent years working in, and ask me where the passwords were for the secondary escrow accounts. David stood behind her like a proud lion, his hand resting a bit too low on her back. He thought he was being subtle. He thought I was too broken to notice the betrayal happening right in front of me. He kept pushing me to sign a quitclaim deed for the house and a waiver of interest in the business. He told me that if I signed them now, he'd make sure the divorce was painless, and that I could stay in the guest room for another month. If I didn't, he threatened to starve me out legally until I had nothing left for a lawyer. What David didn't realize was that I wasn't just supportive during those 11 years in the business. I was the one who set up the digital infrastructure. I was the one who managed the private ledgers. While David was out playing the big shot at charity galas and golf courses, I was the one noticing the irregularities in how he was moving funds to avoid taxes 3 years ago. At the time I had questioned him about it, and he had brushed me off, telling me I didn't understand high-level finance. So I stopped asking questions and started taking notes. I started making copies. I had a digital trail of every creative accounting move he had ever made, including the ones he used to hide money from the IRS and from me. By the end of the second week, I felt like a spy in my own home. I was playing the role of the grieving, discarded wife perfectly. I cried in front of David when he was around, I acted confused by the legal jargon his lawyer sent over, and I let Martha lecture me on graceful exits. But every night, when the house was silent and David was out networking with Chloe, I was on my laptop, finishing the map of his financial destruction. The pressure was building. David was getting impatient. He wanted me out and he wanted the papers signed by the end of the month. He had no idea that every day he pressured me, he was just giving me more time to ensure that when I finally did leave, I wouldn't be the one walking away with nothing. I was waiting for him to make one specific move, the move that would prove his intent to defraud me, and I knew based on his ego it was coming very soon. The third week was when David finally stopped pretending he had even a shred of human decency left in his body. It started on Monday morning when I went to the grocery store to buy milk and cereal for Liam. I swiped my card, the one linked to our primary joint account, and the machine flashed a bright, mocking red. Declined. I tried it again, thinking it was just a glitch, but the cashier gave me that look. The mix of pity and annoyance that you only get when someone thinks you're broke. I ended up paying with the small debit card I'd kept from my secret savings, the one David didn't know existed. When I got home, I found him sitting in the kitchen, casually scrolling through his phone while Chloe sat across from him, drinking coffee from my favorite mug, the one Liam had painted for me in kindergarten. "The cards are deactivated, Megan," David said without even looking up. He sounded bored, as if he were talking about a subscription he'd canceled. "Since you're refusing to sign the settlement papers and move things along, I've decided to stop funding your lifestyle. If you want money for groceries, you can ask me for an allowance, or better yet, you can sign the documents and take the lump sum I offered. This house and everything in it is technically under the company's name, and since you're no longer an employee, you're essentially a guest. A guest who is overstaying her welcome." I stood there holding the grocery bags, looking at Chloe, who had the audacity to smirk at me over the rim of my son's mug. The level of disrespect was so calculated that I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, but it wasn't fear. It was the feeling of a hunter watching their prey walk directly into a trap. The conflict escalated that evening. David hadn't just cut off the cards. He had contacted the utility companies to move the accounts. He was trying to create a paper trail that showed I didn't live there or contribute to the household. He was trying to starve me out, exactly as he had threatened. But the real blow came when I went into the home office to retrieve some of my personal tax records. The door was locked. David had changed the keypad code. I heard him laughing in the living room with his mother, Martha, who had basically moved in at this point to help with the transition. I knocked on the door and David opened it, leaning against the frame with a smug grin. He told me that everything in that office was company property, and that I had no right to be in there anymore. He said he'd had Chloe clean up the files and that anything personal of mine had been put in a box in the garage. That box in the garage was the ultimate insult. It contained my degree, my old journals, and photos of my parents. They were sitting on the damp concrete floor next to the lawnmower. While I was down there, I realized David was making a massive mistake. He was so convinced that I was a tech-illiterate housewife that he didn't realize I had mirrored the entire office server onto a cloud drive months ago. He thought that by locking a physical door, he was locking me out of the truth. But that wasn't the biggest development of the week. The hard conflict happened on Wednesday. David's lawyer, Robert Harris, called a pre-settlement meeting at the house. He sat there with David and Martha, laid out a map of the assets, and showed me a document that claimed the business was actually worth 40% less than it was a year ago. They were trying to tank the valuation of the company so that my half would be practically nothing. David put on a performance, sighing about market downturns and bad investments. Martha chimed in, saying that I should be grateful David was even offering me the car. It was a coordinated, high-pressure tactic designed to make me panic and sign anything just to get it over with. They even brought up Liam. David leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, threatening tone. "If we go to court, Megan, I'll make sure the judge sees that you have no income, no home, and no way to support a child. I'll take Liam and you'll get supervised visits on weekends. Or you sign these papers, take the $200,000, and we keep things amicable for his sake." Using my son as a bargaining chip was the moment I stopped feeling any lingering guilt about what I was about to do. I looked David in the eye and for the first time in weeks I didn't cry. I didn't act confused. I just said, I need 48 hours to have a friend look over the valuation. He laughed, thinking I was just stalling. Your friend doesn't know business, Megan. But fine. 48 hours. Then I'm filing the contested papers and you're out on the street. What he didn't know was that my friend was actually a forensic accountant I had been paying quietly for 2 years. That night, the tension in the house was suffocating. I stayed in the guest room with the door locked, listening to them celebrate in the kitchen. I could hear the clinking of glasses. David was shouting about a new merger he was about to sign, the Apex Colton merger. This was the piece of the puzzle I had been waiting for. This merger was worth millions, and David had been hiding the negotiations for months, so it wouldn't be included in the divorce assets. He was trying to finalize our divorce before the merger went public, which is a massive form of financial fraud called omission of assets. I sat at my laptop watching the data upload. I had the emails between David and the Colton Group. I had the proof that he had moved $2 million into a shell company called MDM Holdings, Martha David Miller, to make the main company look like it was struggling. He was so blinded by his own arrogance and his mother's constant ego-stroking that he didn't realize he was leaving a digital breadcrumb trail a mile wide. The week ended with David slamming a pen down on the kitchen table Friday morning, demanding I sign. I told him I wasn't ready. He lost it. He started screaming that I was a leech, and that he was going to have the locks changed by Monday. He threw a glass against the wall, and for a second, I thought he might actually hit me. Liam was standing in the doorway trembling. David didn't even notice. He just stormed out, leaving me with the mess. He thought he had me cornered. He had no idea that I had already sent the encrypted files to the IRS and my own legal team. The clock was ticking, and the explosion was only a few days away. The fourth and final week of this month-long nightmare began with a silence so heavy it felt like the air in our house had been replaced by lead. David had stopped shouting. He had stopped making snide comments. He just moved through the rooms like a man who had already won a war, and was simply waiting for the official surrender ceremony. He had given me until Friday to sign the papers that would essentially leave me with a small pile of cash and a used SUV, while he walked away with the multi-million-dollar business we had built together. Martha was there every day, acting like the new lady of the house, rearranging my kitchen cabinets and telling Liam how exciting it was going to be when they moved into a new penthouse downtown. They were already spending money that wasn't legally theirs yet, fueled by the secret Apex Colton merger that David thought I knew nothing about. On Wednesday, 2 days before his deadline, David called me into the living room. He was sitting on the sofa with Chloe, and they were looking at brochures for a luxury condo in Miami. He didn't even ask me to sit down. He just pointed at the documents on the coffee table. This is the final offer, Megan. I've increased the lump sum by $50,000. It's more than you deserve, but I want this over with before the end of the month. If you don't sign by 5 p.m. on Friday, I'm filing the fraud allegations against you. I asked him what fraud he was talking about, and he had the nerve to say that he had found evidence that I had been skimming from the company's operating expenses for years. It was a complete lie, a manufactured threat designed to scare me into submission. He thought he had scrubbed the servers clean of his own tracks and planted enough digital evidence to make me look like the villain. But here is where the story takes a turn that even I didn't see coming. I had been so focused on David's betrayal that I hadn't been paying enough attention to Martha. That evening, while David was out celebrating his impending freedom with Chloe, I was in the garage still going through those boxes they had thrown out. I found an old tablet that belonged to David's father, who had passed away 2 years ago. It was still synced to the family's old cloud account, one that David had forgotten existed. As I scrolled through the synced messages, I realized that the MDM Holdings account, the shell company David was using to hide the $2 million from the merger, wasn't just David and Martha. The M stood for Martha, and she was the primary signatory. I started digging into the recent transactions of MDM Holdings, expecting to see the hidden merger funds sitting there, waiting for the divorce to finalize. But the account was nearly empty. There were dozens of outgoing wires to an offshore gambling site and a private investment firm based in the Cayman Islands that I recognized immediately from my forensic accountant's warnings. Martha hadn't been helping David hide the money from me. She had been stealing it from him. She knew David was distracted by the divorce and his ego, and she had been siphoning off the hidden assets into her own private accounts for months. She was planning to leave her own son high and dry the moment the divorce went through. I sat there in the dark garage, the cold air biting at my skin, realizing the absolute irony of the situation. David was trying to destroy me to protect a fortune that his own mother had already gambled away. He was about to sign a merger agreement with the Colton Group that required him to have a certain amount of liquid capital that was currently sitting in Martha's secret offshore accounts or lost at a high-stakes baccarat table. If David signed that merger on Monday without that money, he wouldn't just be a divorcee. He'd be a felon for corporate fraud against the Colton Group. This was my moral dilemma. I had the proof of David's hidden money, which would win me the divorce, but I also had the proof that the money was gone. If I told David what his mother had done, he might be able to claw some of it back, save his business, and potentially even keep our family's reputation intact for Liam's sake. But if I did that, he would still be the same arrogant, manipulative man who tried to leave me with nothing. If I stayed silent, let him sign the divorce papers, and then let him sign the merger, he would be completely destroyed. He would lose the house, the business, and likely his freedom. But so would the lump sum he was offering me, and the child support for Liam would be non-existent because David would be bankrupt. On Thursday night, the tension reached a breaking point. Martha came into the guest room while I was packing a few of Liam's things. She looked at me with that fake sugary smile and said, "It's for the best, Megan. You were never really one of us." I looked at her, knowing she had stolen millions from her own son, and I felt a surge of pure, cold adrenaline. I could have ended her right there with a single sentence. I could have told her I knew about the Cayman accounts. Instead, I just looked at her and said, "You're right, Martha. I'm nothing like you." She laughed and walked out, completely unaware that the walls were closing in on her just as much as they were on David. By Friday morning, the day of the deadline, David was ecstatic. He had a bottle of champagne chilling in the fridge. He handed me the pen at the kitchen table at 4 p.m. "Sign it, Megan. Let's end this month of drama." I looked at the papers, then at David, then at Martha, who was standing in the background like a vulture. I realized that if I signed, I was agreeing to a lie. But if I didn't sign, I was going to war. I had the files on a thumb drive in my pocket, the evidence of David's fraud, Martha's theft, and the true value of the company. My hand was shaking. I wasn't just choosing between money and revenge. I was choosing what kind of person I wanted to be for my son. I looked at David's smug face, thinking about how he had called me a liability and tried to take Liam away. I realized that some people don't deserve a warning. They deserve the full weight of the consequences they created. I put the pen down, looked David straight in the eyes, and told him I'd see him in court on Monday morning. The look of pure, unadulterated rage that crossed his face was the last thing I saw before I took Liam and drove to a hotel, waiting for the weekend to pass so I could trigger the explosion that would change all of our lives forever. Monday morning arrived with the kind of heavy gray sky that makes everything feel too real. We were gathered in a sterile conference room at my lawyer's office, not a courtroom yet. David sat across from me, looking sharp in a $3,000 suit, tapping a heavy gold pen against the mahogany table. Martha sat next to him, her posture perfect, though I noticed her fingers were trembling slightly as she adjusted her silk scarf. They still thought this was about a divorce settlement. They thought they were here to watch me finally break and sign away my life. David's lawyer, Robert Harris, opened his briefcase with a crisp click and laid out the same undervalued balance sheets from the week before. "Megan," David said, his voice smooth and condescending, "this is your last chance to take the settlement before we move to a contested trial that will leave you with nothing but legal fees. Let's not make this harder for Liam." I didn't say a word. I looked at my lawyer, Sarah, who simply nodded and handed a thick, blue-tabbed folder to Robert Harris. "We aren't here to discuss the settlement," Sarah said calmly. "We are here to discuss the Apex Colton merger and the $2 million currently missing from MDM Holdings." The silence that followed was absolute. The color drained from David's face so fast it was like someone had pulled a plug. He stammered, trying to find his voice while Robert Harris froze, his hand halfway to the documents. David looked at me, then at the folder, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and pure terror. "I don't know what you're talking about," he managed to choke out. "There is no merger. That's confidential corporate strategy. It was confidential, I said, leaning forward, until you used it as a basis to defraud your wife of marital assets. And until you moved those assets into a shell company you co-sign with your mother. But David, you should really check your balances more often. Because while you were busy trying to ruin me, your partner in MDM Holdings was busy cleaning you out. David turned to Martha. The look on her face told him everything he needed to know. She didn't deny it. She didn't even cry. She just looked away, her mouth a thin, hard line of bitterness. I watched as the realization hit David like a physical blow. The money he had hidden to keep it away from me was gone. Not because of a court order, but because the person he trusted most in the world had gambled it away on offshore platforms and investments that didn't exist. He had committed a crime to hide money that no longer existed, and now he had a merger agreement worth millions that he couldn't fulfill. The next 3 hours were a blur of legal destruction. Because David had omitted the merger and the shell company from his financial disclosures, he had committed perjury and fraud. His lawyer, realizing his own career was on the line if he continued to represent a client who had lied to him, spent most of the time trying to distance himself from David's actions. By the time we walked out of that room, David's world was in ruins. To avoid criminal charges for corporate fraud, he had to agree to give me the house, the remaining liquid assets of the company, and a significant portion of his future earnings. The business he had spent his life building was now crippled by the missing capital, and the Colton Group pulled out of the merger within 48 hours, citing unethical financial management. The month ended not with a bang, but with a quiet, hollow thud. I moved back into the house, and David moved into a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, facing a series of IRS audits that would likely keep him in debt for the next decade. Martha vanished. She sold her jewelry and took what was left of her secret stash to a sister's house in another state, leaving David to deal with the wreckage alone. I remember the last night of that month clearly. Liam was asleep upstairs, and I was sitting on the back porch with a cup of tea, looking out at the yard. For 15 years, I thought my value was tied to being the perfect wife, the supportive partner, the foundation. I thought that by making myself small, I was making our family big. I was wrong. I had spent a month watching people I loved reveal their darkest, ugliest selves over numbers on a screen. David called me that night. He sounded small, his voice stripped of all the arrogance that had defined him for a decade. He didn't apologize. He just asked if I was happy now that I had won. I didn't win, David, I told him. I just stopped losing. I hung up before he could respond. People think that revenge is about the moment of the explosion, the big reveal in the room where everyone sees the truth. But as I sat there in the silence of my own home, I realized the truth was much heavier. The victory didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like walking away from a car crash. You're glad you're alive, but you're still covered in the dust and the glass of everything you lost. David lost his money and his ego, but I lost the version of the future I had believed in for half my life. Money is a strange thing. It can make a mother steal from her son and a husband treat his child like a line item on a budget. In the end, I have the house, I have the bank accounts, and I have my son. But I also have the knowledge of how easily people can be replaced when they are no longer useful. I'm 34. And I'm starting over with a heart that feels 100 years old. I don't know if I'll ever trust anyone again, but I do know one thing. I will never ever be anyone's free everything again. The price of that lesson was 15 years of my life, but looking at Liam's peaceful face as he slept, I think it might have been worth it. Or maybe that's just what I have to tell myself to sleep at night.